Wayman Tisdale accomplished more in his 44 years than most do in a lifetime. A natural scorer on the block, Tisdale's turnaround jumper was automatic, one of his favorite weapons during his 3 years as an Oklahoma Sooner, where he became one of the greatest college basketball players of all time. The future number 2 overall pick would spend most of his pro career on bad teams, but in that time was one of the NBA's most consistent scorers, spending his best years with the Sacramento Kings, and overall becoming one of the more forgotten point producers of the 90s. Yet for as good as he was at basketball, Wayman Tisdale was an even more talented musician, enjoying a successful music career post-retirement, and showing that a 12-year NBA career was just his opening act. Let's jog your memory. The son of a pastor, Wayman Tisdale grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, spending a lot of his time in the church, where he would discover his first love, music. And while the Tisdales would become known for basketball, Wayman couldn't have cared less about the sport in the beginning, as he would often quit in the middle of pickup games with his brothers to instead practice his music.
I would always continue to play, but Wayman at some point in time during the game, he would just quit.
But by the end of 8th grade, Tisdale was 6'4", and his brothers, along with the coach at Booker T. Washington High School, would convince him to give the sport a real shot, and he wouldn't regret it. By 15 years old, Tisdale was already one of the hottest recruits in the country, with an NBA-ready body before he could drive, as Tisdale would not only star for the Hornets, but would also be one of the top players on the Oklahoma Rams AAU team. Wayman continued to dominate as a junior, playing alongside his brother William, as the two would lead the Hornets to a state title. Then as a senior, Tisdale was the top recruit in the country, taking on a larger offensive role after his brother graduated, and scoring at will. But Tisdale was so dominant that he was often criticized for not putting his full effort into the game that came so naturally to him. And while Tisdale couldn't lead the Hornets to another state title, he was named the National Player of the Year. But now he had to make his college decision.
I've now decided to further my education at the University of Oklahoma.
So with Tisdale having the ability to choose essentially any school he wanted for college ball, he would go just a couple hours away from home, joining his brother at the University of Oklahoma, at a Sooners program that was on the up after head coach Billy Tubbs had taken over a couple years prior. All they needed was their star, and while they knew they had gotten him, no one knew how good Tisdale would be. It was an exciting time for Sooners fans, not only welcoming arguably the best basketball recruit in the nation, but doing the same on the football field, with the arrival of Marcus Dupree. And while football was the most popular sport at Oklahoma, Tisdale put basketball back on the map, as he was every bit of what he was expected to be from the moment he arrived. The true freshman starter led one of the most dangerous offenses in the nation, with the help of seniors David Little and Chuck Barnett. But you would have thought Tisdale was a senior, with the way he looked and played, leading the Big 8 conference in scoring, rebounding, and blocks, as the freshman scored at will, game after game. And when teams accepted that they weren't going to stop Tisdale, they were only left to hope that he had an off night. So with their star Frosh, the Sooners began the season at 13-3. Then in conference play, they would add another 10 wins. And even when they did lose, it was always by just a few points. Yet after a 23-7 regular season, they experienced their first big loss of the year in the first round of the Big 8 tourney. But Oklahoma would still get a tournament bid, and with a player who had been voted the Conference Player of the Year and the first freshman to ever be named a first-team All-American, Oklahoma liked their chances. And while foul trouble limited Tisdale to 17 points in his first tournament game, OU still got the win over UAB. But in round 2, they ran into Indiana, who held the Sooners to below 50 points and ended their season, as Tisdale's incredible freshman year had seen him average about 24.5 points, 10.5 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks per game. So with his freshman season wrapped, the teenager who had just started taking the game seriously a few years earlier was now a national superstar. So with 2 of their top players graduated, it looked like it would be a one-man show in Oklahoma. But when Wayman Tisdale is your one man, you're in pretty good shape. But luckily, a freshman guard named Tim McAllister quickly turned into a great player, and with solid scoring filling out the rest of the rotation, a run-and-gun Sooners offense would be the 3rd highest scoring in the nation. But make no mistake, the bulk of those points came from Tisdale, as the sophomore forward put up a career-high scoring average to not only again lead the conference, but also finish top 5 in the entire country, as Tisdale would repeat as Conference Player of the Year and make another appearance on the All-American first team. And while Oklahoma was a younger team, they were playing with poise, as after an early season loss to Arkansas, they won their next 11. Then after a loss to Iowa State to kick off conference play, they won every Big 8 game after that, as Tisdale had led the Sooners to just their second regular season Big 8 title in the past 35 years. And with 11 wins to end the regular season, the 27-3 Sooners were on fire entering the conference tourney, and kept it going with wins over Missouri and Colorado. But they met Kansas in the title game, the same team who had beaten them last year, and once again, they came up short. But they were back in the big dance, and in their second round game versus Dayton, Tisdale was on a mission, scoring 24 first half points. But early in the second half, he went down and had to leave the game with what ended up being a strained Achilles. And while he would return, it wasn't the same Tisdale from the first half, scoring 12 more points and eventually fouling out, as Dayton pulled off the major upset and knocked out the Sooners, with Tisdale's sophomore season ending with him averaging about 27 points, 9.5 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks per game. But over the summer, Tisdale would get a chance for some glory as a member of the 1984 US Olympic team, which head coach Bobby Knight had began recruiting him for after his Hoosiers defeated Tisdale's Sooners in last year's tournament, and Tisdale would provide the team with efficient scoring and rebounding, en route to a gold medal finish in the 1984 Summer Olympics. After some worry that Tisdale would leave to turn pro, he eventually announced his intention to remain a Sooner for his junior year, and Oklahoma fans weren't mad at that. And this Sooners team really looked like they could make some noise, as along with Tisdale and McAllister, they would get a great season from much improved sophomore Darrell Kennedy and brought in junior transfer Anthony Bowie. But for a team with as much talent as Oklahoma had, their 10-4 start to the season seemed like a bit of a disappointment. And while Tisdale had more help than ever, he was still doing the heavy lifting, leading the Big 8 in scoring for the third consecutive season, as he averaged a double-double for the second time in his 3 years. And to get an idea of how prolific his scoring was, he became the Big 8's all-time leading scorer midway through the season. And around that same time, the Sooners caught fire, putting together a 12-game win streak, and overall losing just one of their final 16 games, as they would repeat as Big 8 regular season champs, and cap off the season with a miraculous comeback over Georgia Tech. Then in the conference tourney, they easily defeated Oklahoma State and Missouri, and with Iowa State being the only thing standing between Oklahoma and their second conference tournament championship in program history, Tisdale dropped 20 points and finally won the Big 8 tournament, wrapping up a third consecutive Big 8 Player of the Year season, while also becoming the first player in NCAA history to be named a first-team All-American as a freshman, sophomore, and junior. And now all that was left was the NCAA tournament. Tisdale would start with 28-12 in a first-round win over North Carolina A&T. Then round 2 brought Illinois State, and they had no answer for the All-American, as Tisdale went for a game-high 29 points, while shooting a nearly automatic 14 of 16 from the field to push Oklahoma through to the Sweet 16. And a last-second turnaround from Tisdale gave Oklahoma a dramatic overtime win over Louisiana Tech. Yet the Elite Eight was their toughest test, drawing a Memphis State team with the big man duo of Keith Lee and William Bedford. And with Tisdale managing just 11 points, the Sooner season ended in the Elite Eight, as Tisdale ended his junior season with averages of about 25 points, 10 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks per game. So Tisdale was one of the biggest offensive forces in college basketball, a man who was virtually guaranteed to get you at least 10 points every time he stepped on the court. Yet while Oklahoma fans wanted their star to come back for his final season, Tisdale had other ideas.
You have made my decision very difficult, but after long, careful, prayerful consideration, I have decided to make myself available for the NBA draft.
So after announcing his intention to go pro, Tisdale was selected second overall in the '85 draft by the Indiana Pacers, with Indiana eventually coming to a contract agreement with the top 2 pick just weeks before the season began. Tisdale had played center in college, but at about 6'8", he was much more suited for power forward in the pros. And while the Pacers couldn't pass on someone like Tisdale, they didn't really need him, as they already had a promising power forward in 4th-year Clark Kellogg. But in late November, they started appreciating the Tisdale pick even more. After Kellogg went down with an injury that would lead to his retirement after the following season. So Tisdale would take over, and in his first game as a starter, he went for 27 points and 10 boards, and would end up being the Pacers' second best scorer this season, which Indiana needed as one of the NBA's lowest scoring teams, as this made it hard for them to do any winning, and after dropping 11 of their final 12, they would finish at 26-56 and miss the playoffs. As Tisdale's rookie season had ended, with him averaging about 14.5 points, 7 rebounds, and 1 assist per game. Indiana continued to add offensive firepower, as they had selected high-scoring forward Chuck Person in the draft, and brought in a new coach in Dr. Jack Ramsey. But Ramsey would opt to move center Herb Williams to the 4 and play Person at the 3, and as Tisdale didn't have the size or defense to play center, he would become the team's 6th man. And while this may not have been his ideal situation, having Tisdale's scoring on your second unit was something any team would appreciate, as Tisdale would put up nearly identical scoring numbers in his bench role, and even had 2 games surpassing 30 points. And off the court, he had become very active in the anti-drug movement, becoming somewhat of a spokesman, encouraging children to stay clean. And on the court, with Ramsey at the helm, the Pacers were showing improvement, doing a much better job at forcing turnovers on defense and limiting them on offense, as they would finish with a 41-41 record, which was enough to get them the 7th seed and a first-round matchup with Atlanta. And Tisdale's playoff debut would see him go for 20 points, and while he would hit double figures in his first 3 playoff games, his shot attempts would drop every game, ending with 6 points in a Game 4 loss, which ended Indiana's season, as Year 2 had seen Tisdale average about 14.5 points, 6 rebounds, and an assist per game. The Pacers kept working to address their offense through the draft, bringing in a skinny kid from UCLA named Reggie Miller, who wouldn't have a huge role as a rookie. Tisdale again began the year in his bench role, but after beginning his first 2 seasons overweight, he was in much better shape to begin Year 3. And when Herb Williams was sidelined for a couple weeks early in the season, Tisdale took over as a starter for about a month. But after returning to his bench role in late December, it seemed like Tisdale was growing frustrated, as he was even kicked out of a Pacers practice for unspecified reasons. But after Williams had been struggling, Tisdale returned to the starting lineup in February, where he would stay for the rest of the season. And over his final 39 games, Tisdale averaged nearly 18 points on 56% shooting. But the Pacers took a step back, as while Tisdale had become the team's second leading scorer in his primarily starting role, Indiana's overall scoring was near the bottom of the league, leading to just 38 wins, which wasn't enough to get them a return to the playoffs. As Tisdale ended the year with averages of about 16 points, 6 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. So Tisdale had shown that scoring at the next level wouldn't be a problem for him. But as a power forward, he didn't give you the rebounding that was expected from a 4 in that era. Yet he still felt that he had earned a starting spot after the way he played during the second half of last season, especially on a team who needed offense. Except for they didn't need offense like they used to. Miller took a huge step in Year 2 and formed a dangerous duo with Person, and the Pacers had a new skilled big man in rookie Rick Smits. So while Tisdale was a high-scoring forward who continued to consistently put up points off the bench for the team this year, that wasn't what Indiana needed anymore. And as he wasn't getting the starting minutes he believed he deserved, Tisdale was growing impatient, especially since his name had been in trade rumors all season. Trade rumors which he would eventually welcome, and that would become truth around the deadline, when the Pacers packaged him to the Sacramento Kings. So Tisdale joined a Kings team looking for direction, and got what he was looking for, being named an immediate starter and getting the most minutes of his career. And he repaid the Kings by not only averaging nearly 20 points over his final 31 games, but also pulling down nearly 10 rebounds a night. However, the Kings had just 14 wins at the time of the Tisdale trade, and while they would nearly double this win total, a 27-55 record wasn't enough for the playoffs, as Tisdale's overall season ended with him averaging about 17.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. So while the Kings weren't great, Tisdale was on a team who brought him in to be a key piece of their future. And the Kings really proved their commitment to him when they didn't give up on negotiations after a lengthy holdout from Tisdale, eventually signing the free agent forward to a 5-year deal. The Kings did have some talent on the roster. They had acquired veteran Danny Ainge in a separate deal at the same time they acquired Tisdale last year, and had selected Louisville big man Purvis Ellison with the first overall pick, but it was Tisdale who became the Kings' first option. This season would see him put up a career-high scoring average on a career-high shooting percentage, as Tisdale would even drop a career-high 40 points in a win over Golden State in early December. But after that, Sacramento dropped 10 straight, and soon after, the Kings made a coaching change and brought in Dick Motta. But things weren't getting much better, so around the deadline, they would package point guard Kenny Smith to the Hawks for another high-scoring forward in Antoine Carr, who would be an effective sixth man for the Kings. Yet while Tisdale was a consistent scorer in an offense that tried to emphasize getting him the ball down low, the Kings didn't have much else for consistent offense, finishing as one of the lowest scoring teams in the league, as they would also finish with a worse record than last year at 23-59. And Tisdale's first full season in Sacramento had ended with him averaging about 22.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. Ainge and Ellison were gone going into the following season, but the Kings had added a promising rookie in Lionel Simmons. And along with Tisdale, these two forwards were hoped to be able to eventually lead the Kings back to the playoffs, while Tisdale hoped he could be the leader of the team. Yet once the season started, it was obvious the playoffs were a long ways away, as the Kings began the year at 1-13, and when the media asked Motta what the problem was, he subliminally directed the blame at the Kings' high-scoring forward. Then in January, Tisdale went down with a partially torn tendon in his foot, which essentially ended his season, with the exception of a 2-game comeback in late March, as the Kings finished with a 25-57 record, and Tisdale's shortened year had seen him average about 20 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. Just days before the start of the 92 season, after Tisdale had openly expressed that he needed some help, the Kings traded to acquire a true star in Mitch Richmond, who also had a perimeter shot that the Kings desperately needed. And with Tisdale expected to be back healthy, it was now or never in Sacramento. So Tisdale would have more obstacles, as a cyst had unexpectedly developed on his other foot, which required surgery weeks before the season. Then a hip injury in the season opener resulted in him missing the next 5 games. And while he wasn't 100% when he returned from his absence, he was available and was the only consistent interior scoring presence that the Kings had. And with the addition of Richmond, he was able to get some more room to operate in the painted area. However, Tisdale was also having trouble with the offense now running through Richmond, struggling to find his own fit. Yet he would adjust as the season went on, and overall act as the team's third leading scorer on 50% shooting. But outside of his scoring, the Kings weren't getting as much as they needed from Tisdale, especially on the boards, with the Kings being one of the worst rebounding teams in the league, and Sacramento got out to another terrible start, winning just 7 of their first 25, before Dick Motta was fired and replaced with Rex Hughes. And while the Kings would go on to play at one of the league's fastest paces, which led to increased production from Tisdale after the change, the trade-off with any run-and-gun offense is little to no defense, and the Kings didn't have the scoring to make up for that. So Sacramento would finish with a 29-53 record and again miss the playoffs, with Tisdale's season ending with him averaging about 16.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. Sacramento tried to address their average offense by bringing in Walt Williams through the draft, and another coaching change had come as well, with the Kings bringing in Don Nelson disciple Gary St. Jean, so the run-and-gun offense wasn't going anywhere, as this season saw the Kings play at the league's fastest pace and be one of their highest-scoring teams. And while at this point it was clear that Tisdale wasn't going to be the superstar he was at Oklahoma, he was still one of the most consistent offensive players in the league, giving the Kings efficient scoring night in and night out, which they would really need come mid-February, when Richmond was lost for the season with a thumb injury. And while the increased defensive attention would see Tisdale's efficiency suffer, he was still a big-time scorer, even tying his career high with a 40-point performance in a late March defeat of the Clippers. But again, the Kings had nowhere near the offense they needed to make up for their non-existent defense, especially after losing Richmond, as it was another disappointing season, finishing with 25 wins, as Tisdale's year had ended with him averaging about 16.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. The 94 season was a contract year for Tisdale, but he just wanted to do some winning. And with Richmond back, that's what everyone was hoping for in Sacramento. The Kings had brought in some rebounding by adding big man Olden Polynice, and Tisdale would also have his best rebounding season in years, Then on the offensive end, he was his usual reliable self, finishing second to Richmond in scoring in yet another season of at least 50% shooting, as he would spend more time than ever at center to take advantage of his quickness. And it looked like something might be brewing in Sacramento after a 3-1 start, but that excitement was short-lived after the Kings dropped 12 of their next 13, and in the blink of an eye, the Kings were headed towards another wasted season with a roster that just couldn't effectively execute the run-and-gun style, with some calling for the organization to start fresh altogether, as they finished with 28 wins, and Tisdale missed the postseason for the 7th straight year, and wrapped up his 94 campaign with averages of about 16.5 points, 7 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. So now Wayman Tisdale was a couple months from his 30th birthday, and hadn't even cracked 30 wins in any of his years with the Kings, while taking a lot of the blame for the lack of success. And he knew if he wanted to win, he had to go elsewhere. So after the Kings renounced his rights, he would sign a bargain deal with the Phoenix Suns. The Suns were a couple years removed from a finals appearance, and still had championship dreams, with their duo of Charles Barkley and Kevin Johnson. And obviously Tisdale knew that he wasn't going to beat out Barkley for the starting forward spot, as he was more so ready to conserve his body and play a lesser role on a contending team. And with the Suns also bringing in Danny Manning through free agency, Tisdale wouldn't have to play big minutes, although he may have had to play a few more than expected after Manning went down for the year in early February. And while it was an adjustment, Tisdale continued to average double-digit scoring and would occasionally appear in the starting lineup. And while he was in another fast-paced offense, this one had the personnel to be effective, as the Suns finished with 59 wins, and Tisdale made his return to the postseason, taking on Portland in round 1. And in his first playoff game in nearly a decade, he went for 21 points on 10 of 14 shooting in a win. Then while his shot disappeared over the next 2, Phoenix still wrapped it up in a sweep. Round 2 was a much taller task against the defending champion Rockets, but over the first 3 games, Tisdale was a great contributor off the bench, averaging 10 points, as the Suns were up 2-1. But after this, Tisdale's production saw a huge drop, really struggling when needing to play center minutes versus Hakeem Olajuwon on both ends of the floor, and the Rockets would ultimately stun the Suns, coming back from a 3-1 deficit to end their season, as Tisdale's first year in Phoenix had seen him average about 10 points, 4 rebounds, and an assist per game. Tisdale signed a 2-year deal going into '96, and the Suns had brought in more forward depth in the form of Hot Rod Williams, but Tisdale was still very valuable to the Suns' offense as a backup to Barkley, and an overall depth piece with Manning not making his return until mid-February, as Tisdale would have an even better scoring season than the year prior, and did so on less minutes. However, he was starting to break down, missing over 15 games for the 2nd straight year, and with Kevin Johnson being limited to 56 games, and the Suns making a mid-season coaching change from Paul Westphal to Cotton Fitzsimmons, it hadn't been the most stable season, and Phoenix's record reflected that, finishing at just 41-41. However, this was still enough for the playoffs and a matchup with San Antonio. Tisdale had closed out the season averaging 19 points as a starter over the final 4 games, and while he was back on the bench come the playoffs, he was hoping to continue that hot streak. But it would be the opposite after a 1 of 9 shooting performance in Game 1, as overall he would shoot about 33% from the field, and the Suns fell in 4 games, with Tisdale's season ending with averages of about 10.5 points, 3.5 rebounds, and an assist per game. By the '97 season, Barkley was gone, and while the Suns eventually acquired Jason Kidd, they just didn't look like a championship caliber team anymore. And while Tisdale was still there, his body was really breaking down, as he would put up career-low numbers while playing the least amount of games in his career outside of his injury-shortened '91 season. Yet although Tisdale's career was clearly in its twilight, he was still able to make some moments he'd never forget.
On the move into the lane, off to Tisdale, he lays it in! The game is over, Phoenix has the win in overtime!
And games like that were crucial for a Suns team that finished at 40-42 and snuck into the playoffs to take on Seattle in round 1. Tisdale would see his minutes decrease every game, overall making 4 appearances in the 5-game series, and never playing a huge role, as he watched his Suns make a valiant effort before falling in 5, with his season seeing him average about 6.5 points, 2.5 rebounds, and half an assist per game. After the season, Tisdale wouldn't find a team for the following season, but this let him return to his music full time, And as he returned to his first love, he knew that was where he wanted to put his focus, announcing his official retirement in October of 1998, ending a very productive 12-year NBA career. Tisdale had always been playing shows and even began releasing music near the end of his career, but now it was his only focus, releasing numerous albums and even seeing his work reach #1 on the Jazz Billboard. So Tisdale was riding high in retirement, but things came crashing down in March of 2007 when Tisdale was diagnosed with sarcoma, and then a year later would need to have his leg amputated in hopes of stopping the spread. And while it was the lowest point of Tisdale's life, you would have never known it. But then in a tragic turn of events, just 8 months after his amputation, Tisdale was gone, passing away unexpectedly due to complications from his radiation, less than a month before his 45th birthday. With some of the biggest stars in music and sports mourning the passing of one of the most genuine people to ever live.
Boomer. Sooner. Yeah.
Wayman Tisdale left the world much too soon, but lived more than most people will in their entire lives. A gifted musician and a basketball star, Wayman Tisdale did everything with a respectful and humble attitude. He had every reason not to be humble during his 3 years at Oklahoma, becoming one of the greatest college basketball players ever. Then while his NBA career didn't reach those same heights, his college resume may have held him to an unfair standard, as he had an NBA career better than most, and could always get his points. There was no flash or flare, just efficient buckets. And while it didn't come with much winning, that's not all his fault. But Wayman Tisdale left the world with a story for the ages, and a smile that could light up a room. But that's it for today's episode on Wayman Tisdale. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his Kings teammates, or this one on another Sooners alum. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.